Roth Center. It's the Roth Center for Jewish Life. It's the home for Hillel at Dartmouth and the Upper Valley Jewish Community. I'm the president of the Upper Valley Jewish Community. My name is Roberta Berner, and I welcome all of you here today. It's going to get a little hot in here. We open some windows. We can't really open the doors. We turn on the fans, so just relax, and it is what it is. But there are some refreshments in the back, and we are the bathrooms are either on the lower level or there's one kind of midway down the hall. Welcome to Daniel and CLASSICOPIA after a number of years. Yeah, it's nice to have you back.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you. Thank you all, and a huge thank you to Roberta, who has been so helpful setting this up, and to Rabbi Mark and everybody here at the Roth Center. It's been a few years since we've been here, but it's wonderful to be back, especially with this really thrilling program, and a new member of our CLASSICOPIA team, who I met while living in Baltimore. Give it up for Seth Keibel. About Seth, he is sort of like the big musician in the Baltimore, D.C. area, one like best musician in that area for many years. Impossible to ever play with him because he gigs every night of the week, but we were actually able to finally play together last year, and I wanted to do this program up here because it's really a fun program and some interesting history that you may not know. So we call this program Jewish Jazz, and we're going to explore a sort of fascinating convergence of two musics in New York City at the beginning of the 20th century. One being this klezmer-style music that came out of Eastern Europe, especially as Jews escaped the pogroms. About 1/3 of the Jewish population living in Eastern Europe ended up coming to the United States in the years between 1880 and 1920, many of them settling in New York, bringing with them their klezmer music, which I'll talk about in a minute what that means. But that music met up with another music, that of the African Americans coming from the South in the Great Migration North, trying to find more economic opportunities, trying to get away from the segregation of the South. Many of those came to New York, bringing the ragtime and blues, and the sort of combination of all this would help turn into what we now call jazz, which had so many influences from many different cultures. And I always say when the Jews and music go way back, of course, to the Bible. In fact, music is actually named as one of the three fundamental professions in the Bible. The other two being herding and tool forging.
I think those are the three original majors here at Dartmouth, right? Okay.
So it's clear how much music meant in the early times there. Fast forward now to the years in Russia, these little villages, the shtetls there, they're all sort of spread out. And what's fascinating about klezmer music is it sort of adapts to wherever it is. We'll take in Romanian, Polish, Greek, all sorts of other different styles, and sort of melt it in. And so it was not surprising that when klezmer came over here, it sort of borrowed things that it heard from the blues as well, and really sort of just kept advancing in different ways. Now, the clarinet was not originally a part of klezmer music. The violin was the major instrument because music was actually mostly illegal in that area. The Russian authorities did not want to hear it. If you did it, it had to be very quiet, so the clarinet's too loud, and the violin was sort of what kept going. But eventually some rules were lifted, and Jews also began joining the Russian army, and especially the military bands in the army. There they found these clarinets, they brought them back to the villages with them, and the clarinet sort of evolved into the main instrument of klezmer at the time. Now, you wouldn't see a piano very often in klezmer because you had to be able to run very quickly when the authorities came. And it's hard to run with a piano on your back, but there were accordions, of course. Then the piano would sort of become more important once you got into New York. Now, klezmer sort of comes from the two words. Klei, meaning a vessel, zmer, meaning song. It's a vessel of song. And the clarinet sort of is that perfect instrument where you sort of hear the whole human emotions coming out of it. The growls and the boips and the slides all come from the soul. And so it really feels like that is the true klezmer style. It's always sort of filled with a little bit of the pathos of the oppression that Jews were facing, but also this sort of irrevocable joy. So you get this wonderful mixture of joy, sadness, much like the blues has that in as well. When people say, well, how do you know what klezmer music is? I always say it, you know it when you hear it, much like what they say about pornography. You know it when you see it. So it really is this sort of idea that you hear this wonderful music welling up. And so we want to just get you started with to put you in the mood, we're going to do the Jewish Suite. This is by an Italian clarinetist named Magnani. And those of you who went to Jewish camps, you'll probably recognize many of these tunes, especially Shalom Chavarim, which is in the second movement, Gut Yom Tov Ai, which is the fourth movement. He sort of takes various themes and sort of puts it in. There are 4 very short movements. Here's the Jewish Suite by Magnani. All right, now we're going to move to that other music again that was sort of slowly making its way up the Mississippi, and the music that sort of really became popular in the first decade of the 20th century we call now ragtime. And it was music born in very humble origins in the brothels and saloons in the African American areas. And most of the first ragtime pianists did not know how to write or read music. They would just sit down, start playing, do one rag, and then the next day a whole nother rag. And it sort of slowly evolved. But the man who was sort of credited with writing down some of these early ragtimes was the great Scott Joplin. Joplin was born in Texarkana in 1869. His mother was a musician as well. She played guitar. His father played instruments as well. And as a young boy, the mom would go to clean homes, the white people's homes in the area. And as she did so, if there was a piano there, she would bring along young Scott. He would sit down at the piano and just start playing. He just was born with this ability to figure things out. Word spread about this young phenom, and there was actually a Jewish musician in the area named Julius Weiss, who took him on for free, gave him piano lessons, but also taught him how to write music, how to read music, the theory behind it all. So Joplin really had a step ahead of most of his colleagues in the ragtime business. Now at age 13, his mother dies, and the father says, now it's time to get a real job and get serious. And Scott decides to leave home at that time and sort of travel up the Mississippi listening to these other ragtime pianists. He really wanted to do that. Ultimately finds his way to Sedalia, Missouri, and starts working at the Maple Leaf Club there, and that's where we get the Maple Leaf Rag. And it's around this time that he'll write The Entertainer that we're going to play and Easy Winners. Fascinating, I'll jump ahead a little bit. Ragtime, although it was so popular at the time, sort of disappears right around 1920 as jazz sort of comes up. And for the next 40 years, people don't even remember ragtime. It's considered this sort of old-time thingy. But in the 60s, some pianists began to rediscover this music. And then in 1973, the movie The Sting came out, and that really started a huge popular uprising of this. The theme song was The Entertainer, so that got very popular. Now you can hear it everywhere on every ice cream truck in the United States. It's The Entertainer. But Joplin himself never considered himself just a ragtime composer. He wrote other music, and his big dream was to write an opera with the ragtime idea behind it. And in fact, he wrote this opera. It's called Tremonisha. He wrote it in 1916, and it was a long opera, about 700 pages of music, filled with a lot of these ragtime ideas. But he couldn't get anybody to produce it. He actually went to Harlem and tried to get investors. They didn't want to do it. And soon after that, he has a nervous breakdown and finishes his life in a mental institution in Manhattan and is put into an unmarked pauper's grave when he dies. But before he dies, he actually tells his friends, in 50 years, they're going to be playing my music. And he was absolutely correct. It took about that much time. And soon after the sting came up, the Atlanta Opera Company finally puts on Tremonisha for the first time, and it wins a Pulitzer Prize as an opera. It's remarkable music, really good music. The plot stinks, but that's opera. I think he would have edited it out had he had some time. But there's some really interesting music, some great dance numbers in there. It's really kind of sad that he never saw that in his own life. Now, ragtime was a real phenomenon when it came out, and we have this wonderful letter of a German tourist who had come to the St. Louis and happened to see one of these ragtime pieces. And he wrote back to his wife the following: "Suddenly I discovered that my legs were in a condition of great excitement. They twitched as though charged with electricity and betrayed a considerable and rather dangerous desire to jerk me from my seat. The rhythm of the music, which had seemed so unnatural at first, began to exert its influence over me. It wasn't that feeling of ease in the joints of the feet and the toes which might be caused by a Strauss waltz. No, it was much more energetic, material, independent, as though one had encountered a balking horse, which was absolutely impossible to master." So this ragtime comes from the idea of ragging the rhythm, sort of putting that syncopation in so you really get a little off kilter. And it really was a sensation. It spread, as I said, it spread first up into the Midwest. We're finding more and more, a lot of women composers in Indiana and Milwaukee who were writing ragtime pieces in 1908, 1909. And then over into New York, and then all across the ocean, ragtime became a sensation, all the way over to Russia. And Seth has a story about that soon. But one of the composers there in Russia was Igor Stravinsky. He was asked once at the time what he thought about American music, and he said the following: "I know little about American music, except that of ragtime, which I consider unrivaled. It is veritable art, and I can never get enough of it to satisfy me. I am convinced of the absolute truth of utterance in that form of American art." And then he finishes, "God forbid that you Americans should ever compose symphonies or fugues," which was not very nice of him. So Seth has a story of how this moment in Russia could have changed history.
Okay, so now I caution you, this story I'm about to tell you may be somewhat apocryphal, but I read it on the internet, so it must be true. And the story goes something like this. As Daniel mentioned, ragtime influenced an entire generation of composers and songwriters. One songwriter who was influenced by this music was a young Jewish kid in the Lower East Side of Manhattan named Israel Isidore Bela. You probably know him better from his nom de plume of Irving Berlin. And indeed, his first big hit, his breakthrough hit in sheet music form, was in 1911, a song he wrote based entirely on ragtime called Alexander's Ragtime Band. It was a huge success. You couldn't find a piano in the United States in 1911 that didn't have a copy of this song on it. And then 2 years later, one of the very first commercial records made in the nascent American phonograph industry was a recording of Alexander's Ragtime Band, sung by a tenor named Billy Murray. Not Bill Murray, Billy Murray. And and that record was a huge success as well. So, now let's go across the ocean. The Tsar is desperately trying to cling to power as the Bolsheviks gain strength in Russia. And he's aided in this effort by his right-hand man, really his puppet master, the man behind the curtain, Rasputin. And a bunch of Russian nobles conspire to kill Rasputin. So the one noble who's been charged with doing this task invites Rasputin over to his flat, or his house, whatever. And, I guess this noble was kind of like, he was cutting edge. He was kind of like a tech bro of the day. Because he had this brand new amazing thing, a phonograph player. And he had that record of Billy Murray singing Alexander's Ragtime Band. And the story goes is this noble said something to the effect of, hey, Rasputin, buddy, I'm going to go get us a drink. Check this out. And puts on the record. Now, put yourself in Rasputin's shoes. Not only had you never heard anything remotely sounding like ragtime, American music, anything like that, you've never seen or heard a phonograph before. You've actually never seen or heard music when it wasn't played for you with the musicians right in front of you. I mean, this must have been a mind-blowing experience. So the story goes is Rasputin was absolutely transfixed by what he was seeing and hearing. He was just staring at this phonograph, mesmerized by it, and that's when he was stabbed in the back. So, the moral of the story is, while we play these ragtime pieces, watch your back.
So as this music begins to sort of get into white society, there is a backlash, as there often is when African American music comes in. Rock and roll and rap music did the same. And a fear sets in that this music is really going to be scary stuff. And a lot of articles come out about how terrible this is. And we have one from 1918. This is in Musical America, really a mainstream journal. And it says the following. The counters of our music stores are now loaded with this virulent poison, which in the form of a malarious epidemic is finding its way into the homes and brains of our youth to such an extent as to arouse one's suspicions of their sanity. It is an evil music that has crept into the hearts of our American people, and it must be wiped out as other bad and dangerous epidemics have been exterminated. A person once inoculated with the ragtime fever is like one addicted to strong drink. Ragtime is syncopation gone mad, and its victims, in my opinion, can only be treated successfully like a dog with rabies. So there was great fear, but I think you're going to be okay when we play these. Hold on, so here's The Entertainer and Easy Winner. came up with the title Jewish Jazz. I like the alliteration, I like the idea of sort of mixing those two things, but I did a quick Google search just to see who else had tried to use this title. And the top thing that I found was a link to an article written actually in 1924 with the title Jewish Jazz Becomes Our National Music. And I was intrigued by that until I saw it was from the Dearborn Independent, written by Henry Ford, one of the great anti-Semites of all time. For Henry Ford, although he seemed to sort of saw this connection, for him it was the worst thing possible, that there was sort of any intermixing, and he sort of put all the blame for this horrible music on the Jews. Now, all of Henry Ford's writings were in Hitler's bunker, so this was really crazy stuff that he was writing. But because a lot of the new generation does not quite understand this, I didn't even understand why, as a young boy, we would never have a Ford. My father refused to get it. Then I read some of this stuff, and it makes a lot more sense. So here's what he wrote. Many people have wondered whence come the waves upon waves of musical slush that invade decent parlors and set the young people of this generation imitating the drivel of morons. Jazz is a Jewish creation. The mush, the slush, the sly suggestion, the abandoned sensuousness of sliding notes are all of Jewish origin. This is, of course, not completely true, but he really saw the fear in that. He then goes on to sort of rip into Tin Pan Alley. Of course, many of the great early Broadway songwriters were all Jewish, and he says the following. The song pluggers of theater, vaudeville, and radio are the paid agents of the Yiddish song agencies. Money and not merit dominates the spread of this moron music, which is styled Jewish jazz and swing. Non-Jewish music is stigmatized as highbrow. The people are fed from day to day on the moron suggestiveness that flows in a slimy flood out of Tin Pan Alley, the head factory of filth in New York, which is populated by the Abies, the Izzies, and the Moes, who make up the composing staff of the various institutions. Tin Pan Alley is the name given to the region in 28th Street between Broadway and 6th Avenue, where the first Yiddish song manufacturers began business. Flocks of young girls who thought they could sing, and others who thought they could write song poems, came to the neighborhood, allured by the dishonest advertisements that promised more than the budding Yiddish promoters could fulfill. Needless to say, scandal became rampant, as it always does when so-called Gentile girls are reduced to the necessity of seeking favors from the Jew. It was the constant shouting of voices, the hilarity of parties, the banging of pianos, and the blaring of trombones that gave the district the name of Tin Pan Alley. All America is now one great Tin Pan Alley. Its entertainment, its youth, its politics, a blare of moronic Judaism. So this is Henry Ford.
Geez, what is with these car guys?
It is a little frightening how 100 years later we have come back to a lot of this idea. And of course, in 1924 was the first big anti-immigration act that came in order to sort of keep the Jews out, and Chinese and Japanese as well. And it feels like we've sort of come full circle to that. We thought we'd go on to another klezmer tune. These are by a composer named Lev Kogan. You may not recognize. He was born in the Soviet Union in 1927. Went to the Moscow Conservatory and studied with Aram Khachaturian, the great Armenian composer. In Russia, he wrote a number of symphonies and chamber works and good Russian pieces. But he also, underground, started a society for Jewish folk music to try to sort of keep that music alive. He couldn't really get out in public because it was not against the authorities, and he did not want to go to Siberia. But at some point, he is able to get out. In 1972, he escapes the Soviet Union and goes to Israel. And at that point, he begins to sort of take out all of these tunes and sort of write transcriptions of many different Yiddish folk songs. And he does a set called the Hassidic tunes, 10 Hassidic tunes. We're going to play 4 of those to give you that sense. And what's lovely and wonderful about these is they have that sort of klezmer feeling, but some of the chords he uses, especially in the slow second one, have these major sevenths, minor sevenths, real jazzy chords to sort of show this connection between the two styles. Here are 4 pieces by Lev Kogan. Oh, now we're going to go to a name you probably will recognize, and that's the great Benny Goodman, one of the first real great jazz clarinetists. Who got his start in the synagogue. He was born in 1909. His father was actually a tailor who had come over from Warsaw. His mother had come over from Lithuania. They happened to actually meet in Baltimore and then immediately got married and then left, went to Chicago. And they would ultimately have 12 children. In fact, one of them, I think, the youngest one, Eugene, just died like a year or two ago. He played bridge with some friends of mine down in Naples, Florida, so I know he was there. But the father was not able to really get enough money as a tailor, and so he had to work, like many, in a pretty terrible job. And here's how Benny described it. Pop worked in the stockyards, shoveling lard in its unrefined state. He had these boots, and he'd come home at the end of the day exhausted, stinking to high heaven. And when he walked in, it made me sick. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand the idea of Pop every day standing in that stuff, shoveling it around. But like many good Jewish parents, they really wanted their kids to have some musical training. And it happened to be that the synagogue there, the Kehela Jacob Synagogue, had free lessons. And so David Goodman went down and finished the story for me.
Okay, yeah. So David Goodman went down to their shul, their synagogue. It was named Kehela Jacob. Perhaps you've heard of it. I think it's a franchise. And he went down with 3 of his sons. None of his daughters, sorry. Went down with 3 of his sons. The oldest of the boys was Harry Goodman, who was 16 years old, and by all accounts a pretty stocky 16-year-old. They took one look at him at the temple and said, "Son, you're going to play tuba." And that was his instrument, and Harry Goodman did play tuba. He eventually switched to the double bass, and actually played double bass in the Benny Goodman Orchestra for many years, being, in most people's opinion, the weakest musical link in that organization. Okay, next in age was Freddie Goodman, age 12, also a decent-sized kid. They took a look at him and said, "Son, you're going to play trombone." And that's how his instrument was chosen, and Freddie Goodman would play trombone semi-professionally throughout his life. The youngest of the Goodman boys who went down that day was young Benny, 9 years old, and by all accounts a scrawny 9-year-old. So they took one look at him and said, "We're sorry, boy chick, you're going to have to play clarinet." And that's how his instrument was chosen for him.
Poor Benny. But he did pretty well on the clarinet and started playing even with some bands in the area when he was 14. In fact, his first professional gig, I think he was 14 or 15 years old at the time, was a great high for him, but later that night he learned that his father had been struck and killed by a streetcar, and his father never got to see Benny sort of become the hero that he was. He would ultimately start his own band, of course, and they were doing some pretty good straight jazz in the early 30s, but they began to experiment on their own with a little more upbeat kind of jazz, which we would later call swing. And the first real official swing concert happened at the Palomar Ballroom in 1935. Supposedly the band played a sort of straight set of jazz in the first half, but the audience didn't seem all that into it. And so at intermission, the drummer for the band, Gene Krupa, went up to Benny Goodman, and apparently he said, "Benny, if we're going to die out there, we should die playing what we want to play." And so they pushed up the tempo, and everybody loved it. And within a few years, swing would sort of take over the world, including a very important concert at Carnegie Hall on January 16th, 1938, which has been described as the single most important jazz or popular music concert in history. It was jazz's coming out party to the world of respectable music. And as Will Friedwald said, "In bringing jazz to Carnegie Hall, Benny Goodman was, in effect, smuggling American contraband into the halls of European high culture. And Goodman and his men pulled it off with the audacity and precision of Ocean's 11. It was a very successful concert, sold out many times over. The high price was $2.75. Those were the days. Ultimately, Benny also was very well known for having an integrated orchestra, a band. He believed that everyone had the right to play with him. In fact, he said once, "If a guy's got it, let him give it. I'm selling music, not prejudice." And so he would travel with that band and make sure that they all got to be on stage together. But he did know, he was a tough taskmaster, but he also knew how to have a good time. He said once, "After you've done all the work and prepared as much as you can, what the heck, you might as well go out and have a good time." So his music has that feel to it. We're going to play 2 of his pieces on the first half, and we'll add a couple more in the second. The first one is called Benjie's Bubble. Benjie was actually his daughter, and that was a tribute to her. And then the second is called Tattletale.
One of my favorite jazz clarinetists, Pee Wee Russell, had a quote that kind of hits a little too close to home for me. He said, "There's plenty of money to be made playing jazz clarinet. Problem is, Benny Goodman has already made all of it."
So now this sort of new excitement of swing sort of quickly turned into a really interesting synthesis of, again, Yiddish music and swing with a radio show that came on New York's WHN right around this time called Yiddish Melodies in Swing. And it sort of was a weekly broadcast, and often you would hear these sort of klezmer tunes with this upbeat swing. And the sort of most famous tune that went through this was By Mir Bis Du Shein. This was a hit that was actually a song that was written by Sholem-Alechem, one of the great writers for the Jewish theater. He wrote it in 1932, and it did not do very well. It was from a play that went down pretty quickly, and the song was largely forgotten. But 5 years later, 1937, at the Apollo Theater, two African-American performers named Johnny and George somehow got a hold of this piece of music, went on stage and sang in Yiddish, by Mir Bist Du Shame, and the crowd went crazy. They loved it. And Sammy Kahn was in the audience, a lyricist and a publisher. He saw something there. He's like, oh, this is going to work. There's a connection here. So he actually went to Secunda and offered him $30 for the rights to that piece, which at that time was a decent amount of money. The problem is that that piece went on to gross over $30 million. And so Sammy Kahn always described how he could buy many houses for his mother and his family. Secunda's mom, for her sake, apparently went to the synagogue every day for 25 years, asking God for forgiveness, certain that he was punishing her son for a sin that she had committed, in good Jewish fashion. There were other pieces like this. And the Angels Sing is another one of the great songs that actually originated in the klezmer world. That was written by Ziggy Elman, who was the trumpeter for the Benny Goodman Band, whose real name was?
Harry Finkelman.
Harry Finkelman. And many others. In fact, there was just sort of a wonderful back and forth with these tunes. We're going to do one last song, again, from the sort of klezmer world. At intermission, we have some wonderful refreshments and food provided by Roberta and the folks here. Please add some donations into their basket to help them out. If you're not on our email list and want to find out about future CLASSICOPIA concerts, you can sign that out in the hall. And at the beginning of the second half, we have a very special guest with us here. At many of our CLASSICOPIA concerts, we try to get some of the young musicians in the area, especially those who have been to our CLASSICOPIA music camp, to come and perform, to give them the opportunity to perform for you. And so we have with us Ray Houston, who's been with us for 3 years at our music camp, and she's going to play a little piece from the Pirates of the Caribbean to start us off on the second half. So we're going to finish with this wonderful piece by Bela Kovacs. He is a Hungarian clarinetist, born in 1937, studied at the Franz Liszt Academy of Music, became a member of the Hungarian State Opera Orchestra at the age of 19, co-founded the Budapest Chamber Ensemble, and is a faculty member at the Liszt Academy. So all very good classical music credentials, but he also happens to love klezmer-style music. He wrote a piece called Sholem-Alechem, Roth Feidman, which means peace be with you, Master Feidman. And the Feidman he's talking about there is the great Giora Feidman, who was one of the great klezmer clarinetists. He himself was born around the same time as Kovacs in Argentina, where his parents had fled in the war. He ultimately would come to Israel, Feidman would, and become the youngest member to join the Israel Philharmonic at the age of 18. But he also, I believe he's still alive, living in Germany, continues to sort of play this wonderful klezmer-style music and helped launch sort of the revival of klezmer in the last 15, 20 years. And so this piece really has all the elements of that sort of sad but happy in it. Starts off with a recitative, a kind of rumbling, and the sadness in the clarinet, the lower part of the instrument. It slowly sort of works its way up into the speed and then gets into the higher things. If you want to get up and dance, feel free. Here's Sholem-Alechem.
We have been asked, due to liability issues here at the Roth Center, you kindly not hoist each other up in chairs.